Assalamu alaikum, good morning, or good afternoon. I'm honored to be here, and I would really like to thank Norad and the great hospitality of the team for having us here in what is, I think, a beautiful city. It's hard to see sometimes with the gray, but, but the little architecture I have seen has been quite impressive. So while my friend El-Hajj is, I think, has spoken so eloquently about this issue, and it's really hard for me to add more to it than that. But what I really want to talk about is build on that message and talk about the specifics, the operational aspects of what local action and supporting and financing civil society in the Global South looks like. So in the humanitarian system, there's a new buzzword called localization. The word encompasses much, but at the same time, it's very loaded and doesn't fully articulate what we in the Global South are trying to achieve. It is about genuine call for equity and justice in an unjust and unequal aid world where the local organizations, followed by the communities and the affected people, are at the bottom of the pyramid, or the last in an expensive supply chain, or as El-Hajj said, the last mile. So how does your 1 kroner as a taxpayer get from Oslo to the person who it was intended for in Kenya, Nepal, Philippines? That supply chain means oftentimes that 1 kroner or $1 is given to a UN agency who then gives it to a northern NGO, who sometimes gives it to a sister affiliate of that northern NGO or a country office, who then give it to a local NGO, who then give it to the affected person or the beneficiary. In each step of this chain, a portion of that kroner is taken by each group for its operational and overhead costs. We estimate in the South that around 20 to 30% of that kroner finally is given to the affected person in the end. The local NGO receives the smallest share of the operational costs in the supply chain for doing ultimately the work of delivering aid to the affected person. This supply chain serves several purposes. For the donor, who values accountability and reliable financial reporting so that it assures the taxpayer, you, that his or her money has been spent wisely. That's a really excellent reason to do it this way. It serves a purpose for northern NGOs who use this supply chain as a means to demonstrate their capacity and credibility and expand their operations. The headquarters and global presence of northern NGOs has expanded by more than 100% in the past 20 to 30 years. There's some northern NGOs that have actually expanded by up to 400 to 500%. For local NGOs, this supply chain serves absolutely no purpose but to reinforce colonial power dynamics. The local NGOs feel that there's 100% risk transference in delivering the aid, often in insecure environments with absolutely no real substantive reward or return on that investment. They are the frontline workers, risking their lives every day to work in war zones where the UN or that northern NGO cannot access, who was entrusted with the money to have access and to deliver the aid. If something goes wrong in that delivery process by the local NGO, then their organization is blacklisted, and not the UN agency or the northern NGO who received the funding, because they claim to be doing the work of delivering aid to the affected people. The local NGO is often a subcontractor and not a real partner that can contribute to the design of the project. The local NGO rarely receives a decent overhead rate. It is the funding from these projects that pay for all its operational costs and not their national governments. Unlike northern NGOs, who are heavily, heavily subsidized by their national northern donor governments. Some UN agencies and northern NGOs actually give zero overhead to a local NGO, while they take 15 to 25% of that kroner or that dollar to fund their operational costs. Zero. Because these local NGOs don't have the funding to pay competitive salaries, their staff that they have invested in over many, many years are poached by the UN and northern NGOs. In Nepal, one local NGO told us that they had 75% of its staff leave for higher paid jobs at northern NGOs and UN agencies in 1 month during the earthquake. This is a serious and systemic erosion of capacity that takes place constantly in the global south. We are told we don't have capacity and there's a risk of corruption. But our ability to develop capacity is undermined by refusals to pay our operational and overhead expenses, and then subsequently by the hiring of our staff. Also, the capacity that we do have, our intimate knowledge and understanding of the socio-economic and political dynamics of our communities, which allows us to design relevant and often innovative programs, is not valued. This knowledge is what allows us to serve aid in insecure conflict settings. This knowledge is what has spurred innovation, such as when Adeso pioneered cash transfers in Somalia. It is this knowledge and intimate understanding of the context that creates quality aid programs and ultimately impact. But there's no dollar amount or metrics designed to value this most critical ingredient in the design of impactful and innovative aid programs. It's almost invisible. For the communities, they are rarely ever consulted in the design of an aid package. Their voices are rarely ever heard, other than maybe a year or more after the project has ended, when an external evaluation team comes to visit them. Sometimes, if they are brutally honest and express their negative feedback, then they are blacklisted from receiving further assistance. I know, this is shocking, but it has happened. They are relegated to the role of passive recipients and basically told to be grateful and to be happy for what you've received. Further, in addition to the supply chain, the presence of national governments, local NGOs, and affected people in any decision-making forums is almost zero. Decisions around the response in Nepal, Philippines, or South Sudan are made by the Interagency Standing Committee, which I had never heard of, even though I had been in this aid business for more than 20 years, until around 2010. And these decisions are made in Geneva or New York. They're not made in the countries with meetings run in local languages, led by national governments, and in the presence of local NGOs and the community groups. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that anywhere from 0.2% to 2% of humanitarian funding goes directly from donors to local NGOs. In the development sector, that percent increases slightly to 4%. So, what does this all mean? We have decided to form a new global movement that has emerged from Southern civil society organizations working across the humanitarian and development divide, who believe this model of aid delivery perpetuates inequality and is not serving its purpose of lifting the affected person out of poverty or supporting their resilience. That movement is called NEAR, N-E-A-R. It stands for the Network for Empowered Aid Response. And this network of NGOs from the global south and east was launched recently in Istanbul at the World Humanitarian Summit. It was NEAR that was advocating for 20% of aid to be given directly to local organizations by 2020. That was one of our primary advocacy messages as part of the WHS. We not only won that battle with the grand bargain commitment, but the target increased from 20% to 25%. But how do donors meet this 25% commitment? How do they get more funding directly into the hands of Southern civil society? Going back to what was said earlier by Mr. Binks about how do we operationalize these theories, these ideas. As NEAR, we are suggesting one solution. It's not the solution, but it's just one. We're being propositional, which is redesigning the pooled funding models so that we move away from the UN-managed pooled funds and Northern-driven managed pooled funds to national pooled funds that are locally branded and that are managed by national NGOs and exclusively for national NGOs. These funds will have different windows for different sectors, from a humanitarian window to a human rights window to an education window, a health window, an environmental justice window, depending on the context. The context of that particular country would define and determine how that pooled fund is designed. The fund will do a capacity assessment of a local NGO and allow funding to be dispersed on the absorption capacity of that NGO. If the NGO can only absorb $10,000, then the fund will only give that amount. But it will develop a long-term capacity strengthening strategy for that NGO so that they can absorb higher and higher amounts over time to be able to reach, let's say, 1 million absorption capacity. When the fund feels that this organization can meet the due diligence standards of Northern donors, then at that point it can fully graduate from the fund and be directly introduced to donors. The fund will create a pool of national partners in country that have the capacity and credibility to deliver aid. Furthermore, the fund is also about galvanizing Southern funding in order to achieve a form of aid independence. The fund will mobilize resources from the private sector, high net worth individuals, and the public in that country. The fund will galvanize Southern funding that we know exists in more and more countries such as India, Philippines, Nigeria, and Kenya. Over time, the funds in such countries will demonstrate that money from in-country could be higher than outside donor funds. Yes, we need to meet the grand bargain commitment and move from 2% to 25% to 50%. But we also need to demonstrate amongst the South that we are capable of providing aid to our own people ourselves. Shifting power is not just about moving money from Oslo or London to Nairobi and Delhi, but is also about shifting resources from Kenya to Kenyan civil society, and from India to supporting Indian civil society. Moving in this direction also requires a level of sophistication and appetite for risk in a digital and information age. Nordic NGOs, when they started 50 or 60 years ago, were a risky partner to invest funding in with weak organizational systems. We have selective amnesia here. We think that the size and scale and capacity of Northern NGOs just emerged magically. No. It is the investment made by Nordic national governments in their civil society organizations that has allowed these organizations to become professional aid organizations. It is through multi-year guaranteed partnership frameworks where each NGO can expect to get millions of kroners from their national governments for operational overheads and program expenses. We in the South have never had this investment, nor will we ever have this from our own governments or any other group. Therefore, donors and taxpayers need to be more risk-willing, as we will not achieve the level of professionalization that Northern NGOs have achieved in the past 50 years or more without some challenges along the way. Financing and capacity strengthening go hand in hand. Capacity strengthening cannot happen without funding. It's like asking someone to learn how to swim, but don't go in the pool. Southern NGOs' capacity will not grow without direct funding to implement programs and long-term investment. Currently, 96% of Norwegian humanitarian funding is tied to Norwegian NGOs. 70% of Danish funding is tied to Danish NGOs. And 55% of Swedish funding is tied to Swedish NGOs. That's according to Development Today. While Sweden is on the surface performing much better, but 45% of its humanitarian funding is going to non-Swedish NGOs who are large American or European NGOs and not from the Global South. So for Nordic countries, and in particular Norway, there's a need for a fundamental shift in how aid is delivered, and this requires both political but also public will. Lastly, I hope that you as a taxpayer will be our biggest ally in creating a more just and dignified aid system that will allow us in recipient countries to take power back into our hands. An aid system that is focused on quality and impact and not purely on reporting and accountability. An aid system that creates efficiency so taxpayer dollars are spent as close to the communities and affected people as possible. An aid system that creates solidarity between northern taxpayers and southern taxpayers, whereby southern taxpayers become visible and counted as donors for the first time. We cannot let this issue stagnate as a buzzword, but we must turn rhetoric of localization into a global movement of action for aid justice. I hope we can count on you as an ally in this movement. Thank you.